This is the second session of the committee's inquiry into the UK-EU reset, and we are particularly focusing this afternoon on foreign policy, security and defence cooperation. And I'd like to welcome our three witnesses and ask perhaps if you could introduce yourselves to the committee.
Charles Grant, I'm Director of the Centre for European Reform.
I'm Sophia Gaston. I'm the UK Foreign Policy Lead at the Global Security think tank ASPI and a Visiting Fellow at King's College London.
I'm Richard Whitman. I'm an academic from the University of Kent and a Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute.
Thank you. And I should say that I'm chairing this afternoon since our chair is sadly unable to be with us for this session. So could I ask you to begin with how important you think the reset potentially is, both in terms of the importance for this country, but also what importance the EU attached to it, and how widely do you think it could go in achieving a fundamental change to our relationship? Who would like to begin?
Okay, well, I think the reset is important. I think we've had a pretty bad-tempered, rather difficult relationship since the Brexit referendum, which has not helped either party, neither the UK nor the EU. And I think that given the very important geostrategic challenges both of them face, with Trump's America, Putin's Russia, the difficult and rising China, insecurity in the Middle East and so on, we need to work closely together because we have so much in common in terms of our fundamental values and fundamental interests. Not everything, but most things are in common. So I think it really makes sense for us to work together and try and achieve a reset. For me, the big question is working together more closely on foreign and security policy, which is happening already to some degree and will happen more, I think. Whether that actually facilitates closer cooperation on economic issues. The short answer is it doesn't seem to be doing so yet, but it may do in the long run. I hope it does in the long run.
Thank you.
Yes, I think well-functioning British-European Union relationship is the central foundation of a well-functioning European region, certainly in security, defence and foreign policy terms. I think there are also dividends of that in terms of prosperity as well, and maybe when we get into the conversations around defence industrial production and so on, the relationships between these two areas become more clear. But I do also think that in light of the re-election of Donald Trump, the question of how well other liberal allies function effectively, how they communicate and coordinate and act, becomes even more paramount, and that means you have to have that very stable foundation. I mean, the reality is the vast majority of the world's liberal alliance is in Europe. So if we're not functioning well here in our home region, then it's very difficult, and that needs to be the basis and the precondition on which we also bring in other allies in areas like the Indo-Pacific. So I think the re-election of Donald Trump has actually really enhanced and intensified the urgency around this reset.
I mean, it is, I think, as the other two witnesses have said, I mean, extraordinarily important to get the relationship right and to change the tone and tenor. And I think from the UK perspective, I mean, there's been a lot of focus in recent years and post-Brexit on a sort of flexilateralism, doing lots of bilateralism, doing lots of minilateralism with others. But the EU-UK relationship has been this sort of the open goal in many ways, particularly since the war, Russia's war in Ukraine since 2022, but also the change in government in the US. So it should be an easy thing to do in terms of the shared and common interests. I think it's absolutely pivotal, frankly, to negotiating a better European security architecture for the future. And so the health and vitality of the relationship, to me, is really an important indicator as to whether we can not just get European states to work together, but get European states together working in an effective way, and a way that best plays to the strengths of European states, whether they're within organisations like the European Union or without.
All three of you have set out why it has become ever more important because of the change in the global situation, and certainly the British government has made clear that it regards it as a priority. My question is, to what extent does the EU think it's a priority? Because there have been suggestions that actually it's sort of moved down the agenda because of all the other things going on.
Well, I think certainly it has been a priority for the British government, though I think the level of ambition of the British government has been quite low, which I regret, and we perhaps come on to that. I'd also say the EU's level of ambition has been quite low as well. I think the EU certainly wants to have the close security cooperation with the UK. That's without question. It values it very greatly. I don't think it doesn't think that's important. But I think the EU is quite happy with the trade and cooperation agreement as it is. It was negotiated by the EU, largely on the EU's terms with Boris Johnson's government. The EU quite likes this deal. It's a good deal for the EU. In my view, it's not a great deal for the UK, but I think the EU thinks it's a fine deal. And the EU's in no hurry to reopen it. And if you say to EU officials or member state officials, we're doing so much together on security, why don't we just think about reopening the TCA? The short answer is no, they don't want to do that. At least most of them do. Some of them do, but most of them don't. Because they think reopening it would be lay you open to the charge of cherry picking or setting dangerous precedents. These very focused with precedent. And if they give certain rights to the UK, then they have to give certain rights to other third countries as well. So I think the EU is not really keen to reopen the TCA, but it is keen to have a closer political relationship with the UK. I think it wants to have its cake and eat it in a way.
It's both the strengths and relative vulnerabilities of the UK and the EU have evolved really considerably over the 10 years since the Brexit referendum. And so there's been this constant dynamism to the question about the motivations of each side. I mean, it is a relative question. And I think in some ways, both sides actually have greater motivation at this exact point. And I think you can really ask the question as to whether or not it was the right thing or not for defence and security to be carved out of the original TCA conversations. I mean, in some ways, Britain held back on that because we felt that it was our strongest card to play. That remains true today, and in fact, because of what we've demonstrated in the conflict of Ukraine, our role as Europe's primary security actor has been reinforced by that. So in many ways, that decision has been validated by the geopolitical events subsequently. Equally, we're now in a situation where we have, because of Ukraine, recognized the vitality of mass. And that's where the EU comes in. And so now the EU is in this position of having sort of starting to get its act together on building an industrial base to which we would like access. So that constant dynamic of relations between the two, I think it's very difficult to look at that in any concrete terms and say they hold all the cards here or we hold all the cards here. There also have been surprises along the way in terms of things. I remember, with the UK-France summit back in early 23, it was actually the French that were starting to bring the questions of mobility into the conversation. And those conversations were really interesting because obviously we could see the sort of, phantom architecture of some future conversations at an EU level as well. And obviously France, having been a kind of key obstructionist on many areas of our cherry picking, were the ones also putting that on the table. So I think what's become very clear, particularly in the last few years, that there are areas and asks and demands on both sides, and they're becoming much clearer what they are. And certainly the EU as this, as our largest trading partner and as this consolidated economic bloc, does have a lot of power in those conversations. But I think Britain's strengths in these discussions are actually more apparent, in part because they have been tested.
Well, and I think we're in an extraordinary situation in which, logically, the EU and the UK are alliance partners in terms of sort of major endeavour for the continent in terms of Ukraine's security, but we've ended up with something which is much less than the sum of its parts in terms of the way the relationship operates. And I think it's interesting that there hasn't really been as much sort of pressing from national capitals as you might have expected in terms of, a better deal, or if you like it, a change of mood. And within the Brussels Beltway, within the EU institutions, there are very, very variable views, I think. And some of those things play out, I think, at the sharp end, particularly in the defence industrial area, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But I think it's, it really is a relationship which is one that is, I think, disappointing in terms of what it's offering, not just in the terms of which we talk about it, but in terms of what's been built over the last few years, and particularly, I think, since 2022. We've ended up with, yes, we have the TCA, but outside of that, we have a kind of organised ad hocery. Things are done, and things are done in a way that make them happen, but not in the most effective and efficient method. And I think sometimes with a bit of sort of grudging acceptance that on both sides that we've got to find a way of operating without necessarily standing back and thinking about those things which we do have in terms of common interests and changing the terms of the debate, as I say, both in the national capitals as well as within Brussels.
Okay, thank you. Dan Carlton.
Thank you, Chair. Does the UK government have an overall strategic vision for the reset? Do you know what it is, and do you have any suggestions for what it maybe should be? You can carry on, Professor.
Thank you. I think the short answer is no, because I think a strategic vision would imply, a real sense of what the end point might be, and therefore that would inform the ambition and what might tuck in behind that in terms of different policy areas. If you just take the security and defence policy area as indicative, I think it's surprising on both sides, but particularly on the UK side, that the ask has been very modest, very unambitious, and hasn't really pushed, I think, the EU particularly hard, or pushed in some capitals to come up with anything that's interesting.
You talked about ad hoc.
Yeah.
So, isn't it going to be like that? Isn't that the point of leaving the European Union? That we're not going to be in this all-encompassing relationship. Yeah. We are going to have to do things step by step.
Yes, but I think that what we don't really have is a sort of place in which we have a sort of serious political conversation about where the shared ambitions are and where it might be sensible to work together hard, particularly in the context we find ourselves in now, where perhaps in the past other institutions and other places could have taken up the slack. But that's not the case now, particularly with the change in Washington. But I think from the UK side, obviously, we recognise that there's a political difficulty in having a conversation about the relationship with the European Union.
Do you think new institutions need to be created to allow that space?
I think on security and defence, there are other places where the conversation happens, and I think there are other ways we might think about that. And I've written about the idea of a European Security Council, for example, which is bringing together all the actors beyond the EU, because the EU is of importance in terms of European security. It's of crucial importance in terms of Europe's economic security and European societal security, but it's not everything, obviously, in terms of how to best secure the continent. And that's a mixture of, the way in which states make a contribution, the way in which they do it bilaterally, unilaterally, multilaterally, and within the two multilateral institutions in Europe, one of which the UK is a big player in, NATO, but obviously the European Union, where we need to find a relationship where both sides are able to get the maximum value from the relationship. But it has to be cast in attractive terms, I think, cast in terms which are also a little bit, dare I say, inspirational in terms of why you would want to have a deep and developed relationship rather than just focusing on some, important but less heroic ambitions.
You agree?
I think that if we look at the current government's strategic vision for the reset of the relationship as a whole, I think it's both sort of trying to pursue as sort of ambitious alignment as possible, but while also adhering to its self-imposed red lines. So you have this ambition and the caution simultaneously. I think, unfortunately, the red lines, and then you couple that with this sort of kind of constant looking over one shoulder to these perceived areas of potential political sensitivity has had quite a coercive and depressive effect on the ambition. So both of those factors are happening simultaneously. I mean, it's evident that much of the work that has been done has been very much behind the scenes. It's been sitting in the Cabinet Office and not really talked about publicly very much. And, except for the work that we're doing, on Ukraine with European partners, because I think that's an area that the government feels it's on politically safe terrain. But I think there's this really profoundly depressive function in the existence of this narrative around Brexit betrayals, and the way in which that would be fed into the media and become a sort of Westminster story. I think that still has a really significant impact on the way in which government is approaching the relationship, and I think that's quite problematic because it's being responsive to and coerced by it's not even public opinion, because we know where public opinion has gone on a lot of these questions. It's actually about media and political opinion. So I think it's difficult to separate the consciousness of that from the way in which government is pursuing its strategy here. And I think certainly when the new government came in, there was a lot of expectation in European capitals and in Brussels that there would be this kind of big reset, and that they would take the opportunity with this big parliamentary majority to kind of really push ahead. And actually they were surprised at the caution with which the relationship was continuing to be approached. So I think the political piece is really, really central here. I think outside, if we focus specifically on the foreign policy, defense and security piece, I actually think in many ways we are approaching it in a more complex way than a lot of the other policy areas, because we have specific strengths. Well, the relationship is more balanced in our favor, in part because we have this, incredibly established industrial base. We've got big primes. We've got, we've demonstrated the capacity to lead in Ukraine and so on. So for us, looking at some of these questions about sort of EU-wide mechanisms, they're not always attractive to us, even when they offer mass. So there are some ways in which that ad hoc approach and minilateralism and so on, we can actually see has been more effective. So I think that's why the approach to this particular sphere, this domain, has actually been so much more complex and requires a different approach to many other aspects of the relationship.
One last one from me, Joe. Charles Grant, you might want to comment on the UK government strategic vision, but also I wanted to ask you, the government says it doesn't have to choose between its close relationship with the United States and with the EU. Is that right?
Let me start with your first question. I agree with what my fellow panellists have said. I think that there is very little vision about the future relationship, because for the political reasons we're aware of, the government is quite reluctant to talk about Europe or present it in a positive way. So I think there is a lack of vision, which I regret. But I think having a summit on the 19th, which will presumably be an annual event, will help, because once you create a summit, you create streams of work that officials have to get on with. And so, in a way, the declaration at the summit and people talking about the summit will force political leaders to give a little bit of vision. So I think it'll improve a bit on that front. I think we do need new institutions. I think on foreign and security policy, regular meetings at head of government level, minister level, official level would help to plug the British into the EU thinking on foreign and defence policy with three benefits. Firstly, we'd learn what's going on, because one of the biggest problems with Brexit is just not British officials, British politicians just not really knowing what's happening in Brussels or Strasbourg or Luxembourg anymore, because they're not physically present. Secondly, it gives us a chance to influence what happens in the EU circle. Of course, outside the EU, not being a member, we'd have much less influence than we used to, but certainly because of our assets we have and our experience and our capabilities, we would have some influence, and being regularly plugged in would allow us to exercise some influence. Thirdly, it would give us a chance to build alliances and friendships which have not been maintained as well as they could have been since the Brexit referendum. So I think new institutions are important, UK-EU institutions. What was your first question again?
And does the government have to choose between its relationship between the United States and the EU?
I think any British politician from any mainstream party would have to say that it doesn't have to choose. But I think if it does have to choose, with the exception of intelligence cooperation and cooperation on defence technologies and some military issues, our fundamental interests and values are lined up with those of the European Union rather than those of Trump's America on issues like Ukraine, NATO, World Trade Organization, rule of law, United Nations, multilateralism generally. It's very, very hard to argue that Britain should abandon the EU just to get close to Trump's America, because in so many issues we just don't share the values with Trump's America. So I think if we have to choose, we choose Europe, but any British Prime Minister will go on pretending he doesn't have to choose as long as she or he can get away with it.
Miss Gaston said that the EU expected that with the Labour government elected there would be a kind of move closer, I think is what you were saying. And you're talking about new institutions. I'm just wondering, is there a problem on the European side that it still cannot accept the United Kingdom as independent from the European Union?
I think there is a bit of a problem on the EU side. I'd put it slightly differently. I think the problem is it's some Commission officials are quite dogmatic and I would put it doctrinaire in the way they view relationships with third countries. I think I would argue that Britain is sufficiently important, a third country, and sufficiently influential in terms of economics and trade and defence capabilities that they do need to give us a bespoke relationship. So when they say, as they do, for example, we cannot give Britain access to the Schengen Information System or the Eurodac databases for Justice and Home Affairs Cooperation. I mean, an official actually said to me, we can't give you access because that would create a precedent that other countries, third countries that are not in Schengen wouldn't have the same access as you. Sorry, that are in Schengen wouldn't have the same access as you. And I said to this official, well, yeah, but don't you agree if we did have access, it'd make it easier for both of us to catch crooks and terrorists? The official said, yes, it would, but it's so important that we don't let you pick too many cherries. I think the dogma is sometimes stronger than it needs to be, and I think the EU officials need to catch up with some of their political leaders who are more open to revisiting the relationship with the UK. Some of the political leaders, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe and the Nordic countries and the Netherlands, are really quite open to thinking things through quite in a radically different way. But a lot of the Commission officials are not. And I have to say they have an excuse for not doing so, because the British, as we've already discussed, have been so unambitious themselves and have not been very willing to set out a vision for a closer relationship.
That's a powerful point.
On the specific point you raised, which had quite a lot of attention over the weekend, the Schengen Information System and Eurodac, I mean, you're saying there is narrow-minded attitude of officials, but this is, like was it supposed to be, a major issue at the summit. Do you think it is still possible for European leaders to say, no, this will benefit both parties? We want this to happen.
I hope to some degree, yes, and I guess there's always ways of compromising and fudging on these things. I mean, I think the British are not asking for membership of these databases, they're asking for workarounds that would give them something close to membership. So I hope with a bit of goodwill, it's an awful journalistic cliche to talk about goodwill, but it really matters. And the British lost a lot of goodwill over the years since the Brexit referendum, and I think Sunak's government restored some of it to some degree, and Starmer's government has restored it further, which is good, but we're going to have to go on doing it and behaving in a way that is regarded as kind of serious and sensible in order to get the goodwill which we need if political leaders are going to revisit some of these arrangements.
Thank you. Edward Morrell.
I'd just like to go back to Dan's point about the EU versus US potential relationships. We've heard in previous evidence sessions about the potential economic benefit of a UK-US trade deal versus closer alignment with the EU, which is no doubt arguable in one way or another. But just in terms of the time frames in which we have, you've talked already, Ms. Gaston, about the change in the reality with the new US administration. Donald Trump seems to be very intent on doing some kind of trade deal. he only has a limited amount of time to do that. Is it entirely possible to do a trade deal with the US, given how long it would take us to get any negotiated agreement with the EU, and not have it affect a deal with the EU? Perhaps if I start with Mr. Grant.
I'm ever since the Brexit referendum, I've been very sceptical that there would ever be a full free trade agreement, by which I mean an FTA as defined by the World Trade Organization, which includes most goods traded between two entities. I'm very sceptical, mainly because of agriculture. Because I don't think the US wants a full FTA with the UK unless we give access to British markets to American farmers. And I think politically that's very difficult, and whether you're Conservative or Labour, it's a difficult thing to allow. And I think the Labour government is committed to a deal on so-called SPS, phyto and phytosanitary standards with the EU. And I regard that as politically very significant and symbolically important. Because if we do a deal with the EU, which would require us to follow EU standards on a dynamic basis, meaning when the EU changes its rules, we change our rules, that would mean we'd have to accept EU standards forever and ever. And so if we accept EU standards, we can't let in American farm products to our markets which don't reflect or comply with EU standards on things, the old chestnuts of hormone-treated beef and chlorine-washed chicken and so on. So I think if we do a deal on SBS, and I think as far as I understand, the government is really committed to doing that, and the summit conclusions will say we will work out a deal on SPS, then that means there'll never be a full trade agreement with the US ever. Doesn't mean you can't do an agreement on certain things like artificial intelligence or digital trade, or you can do an agreement on certain aspects. I think Peter Mandelson's talked about that, but it won't be a full-blown free trade agreement.
Yes, I mean, going back to the question about, do we need to choose? I mean, we will align where it makes sense with both the EU and the US, and with the EU, because of our geography and economic structure, we will continue to pursue a full-fat, comprehensive trade deal that involves an enormous number of different sectors and dynamic alignment. I mean, that's where we're going. And I think on agriculture and pharmaceuticals, the EU is obviously this place. And that's partly reflective of where the British people's expectations are and the sort of standards they want and so on. The real area of alignment with the US will be around tech, and then there will be sort of other areas of alignment that could kind of together be grouped into a, something that could be described as a trade deal, but which will be a sort of collection of different areas of cooperation. I think technology, we have in some ways already made a choice that we will be pursuing alignment closer with the US approach on things like AI. And I think the UK-US Tech Cooperation Agreement, which, there are ongoing discussions about. It's really important to note, I'm spending half my time in Washington at the moment, and the UK is the only country that the Trump administration regards as a meaningful co-creation and co-development partner on advanced technology capabilities in the world, right? So we have a huge advantage with that. And why this is important is because this is also the central underpinning of a lot of defense innovation. So what you can see is the kind of architecture, and this is where on something like AUKUS comes together, where you've got that pillar 2, which is all around advanced tech capabilities, and that integration between the advanced tech agenda and the defense innovation agenda, all of that coming together. So I think that's going to be a really important foundation of our future US relationship.
So if we just expand on that slightly, so yes, AI and defense cooperation, but when it comes to defense, national security, and especially foreign policy, we've got a Trump administration that has signalled a radical shift in its relationship with Russia, and also its expectations of what allies do around China. In terms of trying to walk a political line between relations with the EU and relations with the US, do we have diverging priorities there, and is the UK able to navigate those two things and maintain a relationship with both, or do we have to choose a direction of travel?
Well, a couple of very important things that your question raises. The first is that alignment with the US will almost certainly require secondary areas of alignment, particularly around China. So if we are pursuing UK-US tech cooperation agreements and also through AUKUS, there will almost certainly be demands of our alignment of our innovation ecosystem and how that is secured. And China is, the question of China is addressed through that. So that's one thing, and I think that's something that government needs to really prepare for and understand and map where all the areas that's likely to touch. And then the second part is around the fact that while defense cooperation and security and strategic cooperation with the US is going to remain really vital for us moving forward, we also need to be pursuing this with the EU, and that is partly because that is the mechanism through which the European region, our home region, will be defended. So this is really where the potential conflict emerges, because one of the risks that we are facing is a bifurcation in the defense industrial marketplace, where the US essentially focuses on the Indo-Pacific and partnering with Indo-Pacific allies, and then Europe is kind of focusing on itself. What we have actually been pursuing, particularly over the past sort of 5 or so years, is interoperability between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, and trying to integrate, so things like AUKUS being a NATO-first proposition, so that you can actually, all the AUKUS technologies can be operated in NATO context and vice versa. So the submarines in AUKUS will be used in the Euro-Atlantic, certain things like that. And that's where GCAP and all of these other programs come in. The risk is that you actually start to see a rewinding and kind of stripping out of that process of integration between the security theatres, because under the pressure of European kind of, sovereignty and autonomy and American sovereignty and autonomy. So I think the UK will have a really, really, really crucial role to play in preventing that from happening, because we will be the bridge between the security theatres there vis-a-vis that relationship with the US. So we need to really be thinking about how we ensure that NATO in particular, and then other sort of forums like the G7 and so on, are continuing to emphasize that interoperability and interconnectivity, so that we keep liberal allies and that whole kind of function of defense industrial production working together in concert rather than pulling apart.
As a Whitman, same question. Does the UK have to choose between US and EU foreign policy priorities when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China?
The UK at the moment is hedging. I think the difficulty is that not knowing where US policy is going, particularly where the US is going on Russia, and how we have a particular perspective on Russia because we see Russia as the first order security threat for our nation in Europe. That's a very difficult place for the UK to be, because historically we've chosen to align, or our first order foreign policy consideration has been how do we align our foreign policy to the US in a way that makes us most useful and gives us as much influence as possible. And if we're in a place in which we have almost diametrically opposed positions on something like Russia or on Ukraine, then I think it is probably the most difficult moment for British foreign policy that we've seen since Suez, I would say. But I think even more complicated than that is that if the US and the Trump presidency is reimagining the international order as we've seen it work best for the West, which is a rule-governed international order where we've seen prosperity delivered by particular kinds of relationship and using particular kinds of institutions, and they're walking away from that, then again, that's a really difficult choice, because it would move the UK away from something that it has valued, it's seen its prosperity built on, and seen bottom line as the best way to preserve the nation's security. So, if it can continue to hedge, then I think it's going to get increasingly difficult to do so, unless the Trump administration's foreign economic policy, foreign policy and security policy reaches some kind of settled state. The problem at the moment is that it hasn't, and we don't really know what it might be over the coming sort of weeks or months, and it's very difficult to make decisions, and particularly long-term decisions, on what kind of relationships you want to have, if that is so uncertain for the UK.
Bill Bricker.
Professor Whitman, I just wanted to touch on comments that Mr. Grant made about the Schengen Information System on border security and Eurodac on fingerprinting, and remarks that have been reported that the EU may not grant the UK access. What impact does that have on the UK not being able to have access to those databases?
Well, I mean, it means we continue in the situation that we are now, in the sense that, you know, we've sought to have or sought to put ourselves in a place in which, when the government came to power, it was talking about security pact and sort of broadest understanding of security. So it run all the way through from, you know, internal border security through to sort of classic security and defence. And I think the government envisaged that as a sort of package, and one that was a benefit to the UK to think in those terms. There was always going to be a very, very difficult thing to do, because, as you know, I mean, the difficult legal bases for different kinds of arrangements in internal security, the role of the Court of Justice, for example, and our acceptance or not of its jurisdiction. And so I think that it politically, I think, is very bad news in terms of it's a modest thing to be able to do. And to my mind, it does suggest that perhaps from the EU side, the level of their ambition is not as high as it might be, because I think it is something that's obviously mutually beneficial, but I think it's a very unfortunate signal in terms of how they think about the relationship and how they want the relationship with the UK to continue to be circumscribed and ultimately impacted by, you know, the Brexit.
And given that modesty of ambition, as you put it, are there any realistic workarounds for not having access to those two databases?
Well, I think what we've put in place over the last few years is the way that we try to liaise with third countries in particular, and where we do have treaties and other agreements with third countries, particularly the French, but also the Belgians and others, where we've got the juxtaposed borders, but also where we obviously share a border. So all of those things are working, but they're not working as well as they could. And I think the question isn't, whether we should, whether we can put ourselves in a place in which we'll have a better arrangement. We've got a normal working relationship between the two sides would suggest you would look at things where you can make the relationship work better in an operational sense, where there's mutual benefit, and that's where you would look to see the relationship function much more effectively. And I think that says something about the politics of the relationship, that we are not in a place in which, the obvious areas in which you can have wins are ones that we're picking up on. And it's taken us a very long time as well. All of these things don't necessarily have to wait for a summit to get agreement on. Ditto on the aspects of the security and defence policy relationship. Those things can be done, without some big all-encompassing agreement and or a summit. I think that it's unfortunate that we're loading up so much on the summit, but I think it's unfortunate that we haven't yet reached a point in which we've got a good working relationship that we can work these things through as and when they become important to work through.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Just taking us back a few steps to an early discussion in relation to the UK's ambition for the security partnership with the EU. Professor Whitman, if I come to you first, what do you think the priorities should be for cooperation with the EU, specifically in relation to foreign policy and security?
Well, foreign policy, I think, is the easy one. And I think we're already seeing that. And I think the interesting thing is that the UK does foreign policy with the EU in different places, for example, the G7, as well as things bilaterally, and so on. And actually the sort of the face-to-face or the sort of timetable of foreign policy relationships are a little bit clunky, but it's the stuff that goes on underneath that really matters. I think, as Charles said earlier, I mean, it's once you've sort of set the pulse, if you like, and then you sort of serve that need. Defence, in an operational sense, working with the EU on the things that they do, particularly on conflict crisis management, I think is fairly straightforward and fairly easy to do, and I think you could almost do in an afternoon in terms of reaching the necessary agreements. The thing that's much more tricky is on the defence industrial side, but that's also potentially where the EU has significant value to add. And that has been structured and organised in such a way at the moment that it makes it difficult for third countries, unless you're Norway, but makes it particularly difficult for the UK. And that's because the EU operates on the principle, which I understand, that if you're talking about money, then it's EU money, so it should be spent on the EU. But more importantly, they want to have whatever they develop in that area not leaving them reliant or dependent on a third country. And in a way, it's a curious way to think about the UK as it is other European countries, to think about a dependency on the UK as a negative thing. But I think that's where we're at, frankly.
Okay.
One of the biggest problems with the sort of existing frameworks and their attitude towards third country, which I think has been a mistake, frankly, the extremely punitive construction of the third country relationship with these forums. I mean, this is even in the context of since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you would think, there've been plenty of opportunities to revisit that approach, which the EU has not taken. Again and again, they've chosen to continue this punitive approach. And one of the instruments that they've used to make it almost impossible for the British defence industry to cooperate, even, with a full-scale invasion in our land, war in our region, the stakes could not be higher, is their rules around intellectual property. So they essentially would require British firms to give up all the intellectual property of the capabilities in that process, which is, it's just not viable for them, and it's not viable for the UK in terms of our national interest. So that's an example of a sort of practical obstacle that has needed to be worked through. I think there are also really important questions to ask about what that kind of mass capability of the EU is useful for and where it's less useful. I mean, I think we can all see from the Ukraine war, one of the biggest issues has been around the replenishment of munitions and things like this, where actually mass is extremely important and would add a lot of value as a collective endeavor. There are other aspects of the defense innovation pipeline where the flexibility of bilateral and minilateral cooperation in a defense context is actually preferable to having a large number of actors. And I think that's something that we don't quite know how that's going to play out in the EU context. If you look at something like AUKUS, you've got the three most interconnected countries in the Liberal Alliance and still struggling to work through the bureaucracy of creating things together and moving at the same pace. Think about in an EU context where you might have 9, 10 partners wanting to get involved. How do we ensure the pace is achieved in that ambition, in that context? So I think that some of this is going to be iterative and we'll have to sort of work out as it goes. But I think what's going to be really, really crucial is whatever structures that we design moving forward, and I hope the UK is able to be an influential voice in this, that we maintain that flexibility so that when we're able to actually meet the challenges and the realities that we face, rather than just creating a new kind of giant bureaucratic slow-moving endeavour that replicates all of the problems that we have in our national defence procurement systems, or even compounding them in an EU context. I think on top of the defence industrial piece, that there's a lot that we can do in terms of regular political dialogue, structured meetings, and formal consultation mechanisms with the EU. The UK being able to attend EU high-level meetings, intelligence sharing, joint strategic planning, as well as the access to EU defence instruments. So there's a lot of scope for developing this relationship.
Yes, I agree with what Sophia has said. I'm perhaps slightly more optimistic on the defence industry questions. I think, as Sophia rightly says, the French have been winning the argument, really until very recently at least, on rules on intellectual property and rules on export controls and so on, which they've been creating disincentives to British companies to take part in the European Defence Fund, or also something called EDIP, the European Defence Industry Programme, which is going through the works at the moment in the EU bureaucracy. But I think so many countries now do want a more open system whereby Britain and other third countries should be allowed to take part in EU defence industry programmes that the French are beginning to lose the argument. The Germans in particular switched to support the Nordics and the Scandinavia. The Nordics and the Baltics have always been in favour of more open systems, as are the Poles. I think the French are beginning to lose the argument, which is why the EDIP is currently blocked, the European Defence Industry Programme, because the French and the Germans can't agree on it. And I think the rules for the SAFE, this 150 billion Euro fund, which we read about recently. The rules haven't been decided yet, but they will be relatively open, I think. The French are fighting a rearguard action, but in the long run, it clearly doesn't make sense to have a European defence industry base that doesn't include the British. And I think a lot of people realise that. I do think that the EU does matter for defence industry because it has money, and it will have more money in the future with the new budget to be sorted out in a couple of years' time, the new 7-year budget cycle. I think operationally the EU is not going to be very important. It'll do a few things every now and then, but NATO remains the premier organisation for the European security. And even with Trump perhaps semi-pulling out of NATO or being much less committed to NATO, the Europeans will keep NATO going because it's a structure in place that works. And they want that structure to be in place if and when America comes back and is more fully committed to it. So NATO is not under threat as far as the Europeans are concerned. And as Sophia says, there will sometimes be minilateral groupings. The big 6 countries of Europe, Italy, Spain, Poland, Germany, France, Britain, will meet together every now and then and do things together. And there'll be other formats such as the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is the Nordics, Baltics, Dutch and British, will matter. But the EU will matter a little bit, but mainly for defence industry. And I think on that I predict that in the long run it'll be much more open than it has been, and the British will be more able to participate, I think, in the future.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Just coming back to something that, Sophia, you referenced in terms of the collective endeavour and the importance of European countries working together, just in reference to international aid and the number of, the percentage, very high percentage of aid that collectively is spent, foreign aid, amongst European partners. 44% of all global aid comes from the EU. Do you think there's any merit in the UK working with EU partners to coordinate a policy or delivery in this particular area? Charles, I'll come to you on this particular.
Okay, well, I think there is merit in, because the British overseas aid programmes have had a very high reputation in Europe, often regarded as some of the best managed and most focused on poverty elimination. And the EU also has quite a good reputation as well for much of what it's done. So I think they have worked together quite well and coordinated a bit, but they're all suffering from savage cuts. And not just the British programme, but a lot of European aid programmes being very hugely cut as well. So I think there'll be certain benefits in trying to coordinate to make sure they don't duplicate and try and, if one country's cutting back in aid programmes in a certain part of the world, perhaps the EU should not cut back so much and vice versa. So I think the more coordination, the better.
Do you think this might be a topic for the summit in May?
That's an interesting thought. I haven't heard it raised so far, but I think that is an interesting thought, and I hope it would be a good idea to make it a topic for the summit, I think.
Okay. Does anybody else want to comment on that particular area?
Maybe just to add, I think that's an area that demonstrates very well what we've lacked in the relationship, which is being able to have a sort of high-level discussion around, what the broad ambitions are in particular policy areas. If you look at comparable partners, Canada and Japan, for example, their relationships, there's the trade relationship is one thing, but there's also a structure for the political dialogue broadly understood, where there's set shared ambitions which both sides have agreed on, and then an agenda to do so. They're not works of perfection, but we don't have that. And the TCA and the institutions of the TCA are just not equipped to have those kind of conversations, and frankly to make effective use of resources, because if the one thing that we absolutely do share in common with the EU is our sort of anxiety about the Western order, if we want to put it in those terms, and our neighbourhood, then these are the ways, in concrete and tangible ways, that we should be looking at how we most effectively use our resources. The EU is always going to have more scale, but there are things that the UK does and is able to do that would add significant value to the EU, as much as the EU would add value for us. The strange thing is we have a great stake in the EU being successful in this area, but we have no say. And we've got to find ways in which we can sort of nudge or at least seek to influence where we can.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Chair. You've all separately spoken about the challenges with defence industrial cooperation. I've seen some of that in my own area, in the Black Country, where we have a lot of defence manufacturers that have lost out on contracts with EU suppliers that they might otherwise have got before Brexit. I wonder, we've talked through the barriers. How likely do you think it is that we get a better deal, and what might that look like after the negotiations? Maybe Professor Whitman, if you start.
I think this is also a level of ambition question, isn't it? Because, if you think about it logically, the one thing we know that Europeans don't produce enough for their own defence. And we're now finding ways to raise the money to make it possible to buy, but also the realisation that one of the key problems we have is the infrastructure in place to make it possible. And we've seen that with ammunition, and it's right the way across the board. And logically, what we actually need in Europe is a sort of common market for defence, frankly. Which
our red lines cause a problem with that.
Well, sectorally specific and all that. But I say that not to be flippant, but really, we need to be looking at how we eliminate the barriers to making it possible to produce more of what we need more effectively, which is not just how we raise the money or how we move the money around and how we procure, but it's also, for example, how we move information around. And it's very difficult to move information across borders in the defence area. And people, we've got highly skilled people who are working in the industry both to build but also to service, and moving them around is also one of the things which is more complicated since Brexit, also for the UK. So I think, to me, this is one of the areas in which the British government could say, we have a shared interest here, we have something to offer. We just, instead of looking at the programmes that the EU has put in place in the way in which it wants to support the development of an EU defence industrial infrastructure, to say, what could we build collectively that's not going to cross our respective red lines, but is going to add to the one thing we need, which is to provide for our own defence and to give Ukraine the means to provide for its own defence. And the EU sort of lined up on that, and we're lined up on that as an ambition. And how do we actually think about a way of eliminating all the things that would make it much easier to do that, frankly.
Thank you. And Mr. Grant, you spoke about the SAFE fund, the 150 billion cross-EU package that's available. Might the UK access that, and how would we go about negotiating that access?
The rules for the SAFE have not yet been agreed by the EU, and there's as always, an argument between the French and the others on how open these rules should be. I think the Commission, which is quite French in its thinking, has proposed that basically it'll be that you need 2 member states to be able to bid for a contract under this procurement, or 1 member state in a third country that is allowed to bid. And when Britain has its defence pact agreed, it will in theory be allowed to bid, but there has to be another agreement between the UK and the EU first to say what terms the UK would be allowed to take part, and that means basically you pay to play. So there'll be some idea that the British will have to put in some money to the fund in order to get loans out of the fund. So this has all got to be settled out. But to answer your earlier point, I do think you could be optimistic about things changing in the future. Political leaders in Europe will have to become a bit more flexible. The French will in particular have to move some way from where their current position is. And I also think that the point about visas is very important. Defence companies, like lots of companies, find it very hard to move people from one side of the channel to another at short notice because of the visa requirements. One of the problems there is that the competence for visas on the EU side is shared between the European Union and the member states, so nobody can just fix the problem like that. But I think this should be. I hope one of the priorities for the summit is make it easier for people to work on the other side of the channel, not just touring musicians, but business people as well.
And to complete the circle, Ms. Gaston, do you have anything to add? Any extra?
Well, I think the issue is that one of the impediments to the EU being an effective defence industrial actor thus far has been that national governments there's essentially a carve out to give preference to national companies. So the whole there's a sort of ideology around it that is inherently parochial, and for us to collectively in Europe get serious about building a defence industrial base that could, firstly rival what the United States has been able to offer, and obviously this is separate to the very specialised things that the US provides, which we cannot fill, but just on the kind of mass and scale, and to meet the realities of where we are, we're going to have to move beyond that. Every country is going to have to take some hits to its own direct national interest and its preferences of its firms. That, there will, with every decision, there will be some countries that are losing out. And until we develop a culture where that we are comfortable for that to happen, it's going to be very difficult for us to move forward on this. I mean, I mentioned AUKUS earlier, but it's such a fascinating microcosm of what the same challenge is going to be. I mean, the competitiveness in creating a trilateral marketplace between just 3 partners, and how you actually structure innovation challenges so that you actually produce the capability as effectively and quickly as possible. That doesn't always mean that it can be totally equally balanced between all 3 partners. And the same is going to be the case in the EU context. So, and this is where I think that what we need to be influencing towards is an EU structure where you somehow balance having the scale of that mass marketplace with an innovation pipeline that is more focused around flexible minilateralism, that produces the best kit most quickly and most cheaply, and allows other partners to buy it. But being able to be a privileged customer versus a producer is a mindset shift that we're going to have to take. So, and that's going to involve Britain taking some hits on this as well if we want to be involved with this. So that to me is the big kind of political question that is underlying a lot of this and will actually be deeply contingent on its effectiveness.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, John. I wondered whether we could expand a little bit on what you've said so far around support for Ukraine and the EU-UK relationship. Thinking about the US being unreliable in the support that it's giving to Ukraine, and certainly inconsistent, could you say what you think the EU could do in place of the United States? What more could the EU do to support Ukraine? Perhaps start with Richard.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think we have to give some credit to the EU because, I mean, it has moved itself into a place that's, I think, extraordinary in terms of what most long-time observers with the EU would have thought about in terms of, for example, getting together to buy ammunition and so on, and the scale that it's undertaken, training and the resources that it's given to Ukraine. But all of those, that's in the past now. The question is, how do we best secure Ukraine for the future? In, as you say, the uncertainty around the level of US support. That's putting it politely. And clearly, one of the things that the EU is doing is thinking about how you integrate Ukraine into all of these developments, which is why Ukraine has a special pass when it comes to thinking about defence industry in particular, because, of course, the recognition being that we have as much to learn from Ukraine as we have to teach Ukraine. And what Ukraine needs more than anything else is money from us so it can build what it's got even more effectively in partnerships in areas in which it's either operating kit so it can get it back onto the battlefield effectively, and that's the sort of things that Germany is doing, for example. But I think that this is also an obvious area where you can think that the EU and the UK can forge a genuine strategic partnership. I mean, this is bandied around a lot, but what does a strategic partnership mean and what should it mean? It should mean that we have a clear sense as to what the objective is, and we look at the way in which we can best deliver on the strategy. We've committed to provide for Ukraine's security or assist Ukraine with its security. And that means many things, not just the pledge to do so, but the way that we're going to resource it. And the way that we have to resource it from now on, we've sort of gone past the early phase, which is giving Ukraine stuff, which we already had. It's now how we gear up to build the stuff that we need for the very long term, how we're able to stockpile that for our own use, but also for Ukraine's use. And how we get that sort of backwards and forwards between Ukraine and ourselves in terms of innovation, particularly in the areas that have been so important on the battlefield. All the things that the EU have done with the UK on sanctions, the way that coordinate and liaise diplomatically, and also on the training area and so on, we've got to step up massively if we're really going to provide Ukraine with the support it needs. And I don't sense at the moment that there is a plan, to put it frankly. And we've got the arrangements that we, in a way, inherited from the US in terms of the Ramstein process, and obviously the UK is now on that. But, how are we going to sustain that without the United States? In what areas can we not sustain it without the United States? What's the maximum that we can deliver? And what are the things that we can't deliver on? And how we're going to put in place compensating arrangements for that. I don't think that's certainly not something that we seem to have got into in terms of a conversation about this is where the EU and the UK should strike an alliance for the purpose of delivering that much more effectively. To my mind, it's too piecemeal. It lacks that sort of strategic sight, and it's much more thinking about how do we just manage day to day rather than where do we want to be, how do we lock Ukraine in, and how do we support Ukraine.
Thank you, Professor Whitman. And then to develop that a little bit more, Ms. Gaston, I was thinking about the coalition of the willing. The European Union has a seat at the table, but isn't participating as a member of the coalition. Obviously, not all EU countries are signed up as part of that coalition. Is there anything more that the EU could do in terms of its stance around a so-called reassurance force for Ukraine?
I mean, certainly, but whether that's actually conceivably possible in terms of building consensus amongst the 27, I just don't think that's where we are at the moment. And I think what's really, really important with a reassurance force and the coalition of the willing, and I think this is something that's actually been helpful in terms of the way the British and French have approached this, which is let's bring the kind of first movers, the most enthusiastic, out to the front. It's a volunteer endeavour, which has meant that everybody who is speaking on behalf of the coalition of the willing is really enthusiastic and totally aligned in, the commitment to Ukraine and the need for it to have that stability and security moving forward. So you're not having what you often have in the EU context in these sorts of conversations, which is, disruptive actors and feet draggers and dissenters and so on, muddying the message. Part of the kind of deterrence function of that force is projected through the confidence of those all involved in it all being, on the same page. That said, obviously, not everybody is entirely on the same page because there are a lot of questions about what that force looks like and the context in which it needs to be surrounded, particularly the absolute utility of and necessity of the US playing a role there as underpinning the presence of such a coalition. So I don't know that it would actually be helpful for the EU to pursue greater public involvement with that if it is not able to secure consensus amongst the EU27. In fact, could be a risk to the conversation. But I think it's really good that it has a seat at the table. We should also note that because it doesn't look as though that Ukraine has an immediate pathway towards NATO anytime soon, the role of Ukraine's potential pathway to the EU becomes more important and slightly more, somewhat more strategic and security-oriented because it is having to play that role, that kind of reassurance function. So, and there will be a lot of dimensions that covers, including very significantly the future health of Ukraine's economy, so it can try and get back on its feet, the reconstruction fund and so on. I would expect the EU to play a very, very significant role in that. But I think the coalition of the willing is probably somewhere a space where that ad hoc nation level kind of leadership is probably actually most effective at this stage. Also because it's involving other actors. I mean, you have countries like Australia participating in that. So.
Cameron.
Thank you, Chair. We've talked about red lines in some of the earlier questions, but I'm really keen to know what your views are on the government's self-imposed red lines in terms of how this can help or hinder barriers to trade. Mr. Grant, I'll start.
Okay, well, as far as I can see, the red lines are here to stay for the foreseeable future. And before I answer the specific question, let me make a broader political point, which we haven't touched on yet, which is one of the things that matters most to European partners about the UK is its political system and the way its political system is evolving. So if you talk to the French or German governments or the Commission about what kind of deal they might offer the British and how flexible they could be to get a more ambitious deal with the British, they say things like, well, yes, maybe we could do that, but then if there's another government in the UK in 4 years' time which is very Eurosceptic or committed to tearing up these deals, what's the point? So the fact that the British political system is very seriously divided on the European question is actually a factor that matters for the ability of the UK to get an ambitious deal with the EU, and we haven't mentioned that. But on your specifics about the red lines, I don't see the red lines changing. And I personally, as I've said before, would like to see a more ambitious agreement with the European Union. But I think, however, and I've got a few ideas as to how you could get a better deal than the TCA. But let's be frank, as you imply by your question, so long as the red lines remain, it's not going to be enormously different. And I think, somebody in Mrs. von der Leyen's office said to me recently, what the British are slowly learning is that even with the best will in the world, any improved relationship with the EU isn't going to be fundamentally different from Boris Johnson's Brexit settlement because of the red lines the Labour has set. I don't see them changing. However, the red lines do not go as far as saying no dynamic alignment with the EU rules and regulations. They haven't said that. They don't say no role for the European Court of Justice. So that's my answer is go sector by sector. I think we can get closer to the EU in several sectors. We've already discussed SBS, plant and animal health. I think that will happen because the British government is committed to it. The next obvious sector to look at is energy, where I think there's a mutual self-interest in getting closer to the EU. We have to do a deal with the EU to merge our emissions trading schemes quite soon. If we don't, then British exporters to the EU will get clobbered by the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU has introduced. So there's a strong self-interest in the UK to do that, and I think it'll happen. Also, electricity trading. We lost the good model of electricity trading that we had before Brexit. So we pay more for our electricity now, and there's less security of supply for both sides of the channel than there would be if we went back to some system of de facto being part of the single market for electricity trading. Again, we'd have to accept dynamic alignment, I realise that, but I think there's a close mutual self-interest in getting closer on energy. And once you've done SBS and you've done energy, then you can maybe look at a few other areas like chemicals or pharmaceuticals, or I don't know. There's a limit to how far you can go, of course, because if you go too far, then the EU will say, hang on a minute, what about freedom of movement? You can't be in bits of the single market without having freedom of movement. But I do think, in the long run, we can keep these red lines for the time being, but still get a better, more economically advantageous deal for the United Kingdom if we go sector by sector.
Thank you. Ms. Gaston.
I think one of the reasons why I think there was a hope and maybe an expectation that the Labour government might come in and do something really bold, say, for example, I don't know, rejoin the customs union or something, is because, where public opinion is at and having an EU majority in Parliament, they're not guaranteed to last in the future. I mean, to Charles's point about future uncertainties politically, I mean, if you're going to do those sorts of things, I think there is a fair argument to say that an approach of kind of, careful incrementalism, or we'll do this in our first term and then in the second term we'll be able to move to this. I mean, you're relying on so many hypotheticals about situations that, may never present themselves again. I mean, where we could be and where EU could be in even just a few years could be, with I think all the domestic social and political pressures and economic pressures could be, in a place that's less favourable for those sorts of things. So I think that was sort of driving some of the expectation that there might have been a willingness to confront the red lines. And I think in a way the sort of Trump situation has created these kind of political opportunities to say, well, circumstances have changed and now we need to look at this, or even just coming into government, we looked under the bonnet and the economic situation was really difficult, and so we're going to need to make some different decisions. So I think that's for a lot of people who would like to see a more ambitious and closer relationship, I think that is really driving the frustration. But I agree with Charles that there is an enormous amount that you can do even around the straitjacket of those red lines. And I think it's also important to think about where the EU itself is changing. I mean, the attitude towards migration in the EU has changed significantly over the past few years. I mean, we now have border checks in a lot of Schengen countries. There's reforms towards asylum seeker policies and so on going on at national level.
Stick to trade because I've got a couple of follow-up questions.
Okay.
But, I'll go to Professor Whitman.
Thank you very much. I mean, I don't think I could do a better job in sort of setting out the difficulties with the red lines, but maybe two things on them. One is the shadow that they throw in other areas, and I think that's what we're seeing, for example, in the defence area, because it does create difficulties because of the kind of relationship we've got. And you'll be well aware that there's a good reason why Norway has a more developed security and defence policy relationship with the EU than appears to be possible for the UK because of being a member of the European Economic Area and in Schengen. And for the EU, that's the EU's red lines. So, we've got two sets of red lines, not just the UK red lines that creates problems. But I think also, the government doesn't seem to explore the possibility of having a conversation about the red lines in the context of, for example, the TCA review. That we could have a national conversation about what we think might be a good agenda for the TCA. Under the coalition government, if we work back in time, we had something called the Balance of Competences Review, which looked at what the benefits and costs to the UK were in different policy areas with the relationship that we had with the EU, which is a member state. We could do something very similar for the TCA. And then at least we'd have a decent evidence base, I think, on which we could argue then, are these a good or a bad thing? But it perhaps changed the debate. And also, we need to recognise that we've ended up with a sort of peculiar one-legged stool. We've got everything is on this particular trade relationship that we've got, and it makes it so difficult to develop the relationship in other areas which are allied to the economy. And foreign economic policy is absolutely allied now to how we can run the UK economy.
Thank you. So given the red lines and the constraints that you've all set out, how do you think the UK or even the EU could go further in removing some of the barriers to trade in goods, including on VAT regulations and customs non-tariff barriers? Are there one or two easily identifiable things? I think you're brimming with ideas. If you would pick one or two to go further, what would you pick?
Well, a couple of, off the top of my head, the so-called Pan-European Mediterranean Convention, the PEM, which is about rules of origin. If the EU agreed, and I think it would agree, Britain could join that, which would allow supply chains to more easily comply with EU rules of origin and benefit, therefore British exporters can more easily benefit from the zero tariffs that apply to goods negotiated, the goods manufactured in the EU, the UK, and if we join PEM, which is Turkey, Switzerland, and so on, and several other countries. I think that'd be a small benefit. Mutual recognition of certification bodies. So the EU has granted that to some other third countries in free trade agreements. Didn't give it to the British because they didn't like the idea of Britain having a good certification institute that certifies medical equipment and car parts and so on. It's complying with good safety standards. But that's something the EU could grant the UK with a bit of goodwill. And I think, as I mentioned already, visa issues. I mean, the EU has an issue that to get a visa to enter the UK for work, you need to have the visa has to be sponsored by somebody, which is quite bureaucratic for people on the EU side. They don't have an equivalent system of their own. So that is the EU complaint. The British complaint is that the rule about 90 out of 180 days you can't live in an EU country or stay in an EU country. And as I said before, the rules differ in every single EU country anyway. So there's a lot of difficulty for British firms to send people to the EU for a few weeks or a few days. I think visas the PEM Convention, certification bodies would be small but useful steps in the right direction. And of course, touring artists, let's let them travel to the EU, but that requires the EU to change its rules on cabotage, which is quite an awkward, difficult issue for the EU to do. But let's make it a big British demand so the EU can trade it off against something else.
Accounted for there, maybe.
Yeah.
I'll come to Sophia.
I agree with all of those. And, I think this youth mobility scheme is an obvious win-win that, again, that's something that is outside. The reason I was bringing up migration earlier is because it is relevant to trade, because freedom of movement is contingent on the single market and so on. So the EU regards them as the same. So if we're having conversations about youth mobility, then we're having a conversation in a space that is related to and with linkages to economic and trade questions. So I think there's something that we can, I think we can use that as a gateway to other conversations. I know there are concerns with that about, in the Home Office and about numbers and so on. You could easily add in, caps for each individual country, so you have a kind of balanced, and that there's sort of one in, one out. That you could also add an academic and research cooperation kind of dimension to that. Students, our higher education institutions are really in a financially difficult position at the moment. What can be done in the UK-EU relationship to ameliorate that? So I think that there's no shortage of opportunities. And I think what has been interesting and challenging at times is the way in which certain issues have become contingent on other issues, and we need to be separating those out where it's unhelpful, i.e. fish and defence cooperation, and also trying to leverage those where the EU is bringing them together, like mobility and some of the trade and customs barriers.
I'm going to move to Afra, because I know you have to get away.
Yes. Sorry. I know we were coming to fish next. I wondered if Professor Whitman could just summarise his two, maybe.
Very quick.
30 seconds. Those are all great ideas. I think the other thing it's worth looking at is where we've learnt. We learnt on Horizon, and the Horizon deal, that we could actually negotiate something that's mutually beneficial in an area in which we have a strength and the EU has a strength, and we fiddled things on the money side in a way that were not disadvantageous. So I think, that to me is actually one of the most positive episodes we've had in the post-TCA relationship. So let's learn from that. The other, if I may say so, is that we should also press the EU to tell us where it has best-in-class agreements in different areas, and to explain to us why we can't have that best-in-class agreement. If you just take, the foreign policy area or defence policy area, now we have Ukraine, which has a particular kind of relationship with the EU, and we are now able to point to that and say, you can do that if you really want to. And I think we should be a bit more confident in doing it in some other areas and saying, yes, please.
Six great ideas there.
Thank you. And I wanted to focus a bit on the trade-offs, and obviously we've mentioned fish. The current agreement on fisheries does expire in June of next year, and obviously there's been a very public discussion, particularly from some EU member states, about linking a defence and security agreement to fishing rights. Maybe going to you first, Mr. Grant, how do you think the government should approach this trade-off?
Well, I think, the latest I've read is that there will be probably an agreement on this, so that I think there's a good chance of getting an agreement on the Security and Defence Pact in time for the summit. And I think in return the British will make some sort of commitment, at least informal at this stage, to roll over the existing amount of fish that the EU takes out of British waters for another 3 or 4 years. I don't know, more than 2 years anyway. And I think this will be the agreement. And I think, I'm not an expert on fish, I should add, but what the French and the EU is demanding is not completely unreasonable at all, because as you know, post the Brexit settlement, the EU has been allowed to take a greater share of fish from British waters, I think 5 or 6 years in a row. And what the French are saying is let's keep that higher level for the future. And the British were initially reluctant to do that. But the French, because the truth is both sides think they got a bad deal in the Brexit settlement, so both sides are a bit difficult on this. But I think what the French are asking was not inherently unreasonable. I think it was unreasonable of them to say no deal on defence without a deal on fish. That was ridiculous. And many other governments thought that was ridiculous. Many EU governments thought that was ridiculous. But on the substance of the French request, I think it's not unreasonable, and I think that's probably the way forward. The French want a multi-annual agreement. The British, if they're stroppy, can say, well, if there's no agreement at all, then we have to negotiate annually, which gives the British many cards to play, because we have more fish, relatively speaking, than they do. So it is a British card, fish. And that's why the French have been so concerned to get that card removed from the table. And I think it'll be okay, but I hesitate to predict. One never knows.
Are there other areas you think there might be particularly difficult trade-offs? And I guess linked to that is where there are industries that might be relatively small but vital for some parts of the UK, like fisheries, which is really important for some of our coastal communities. What can they do to not get lost in these negotiations?
I'll leave that to my colleagues to answer.
You're close. You're in the heartlands now.
I live close to the coast, maybe.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we've obviously learned, or we've forgotten, and we've relearned is linkage, and the EU's strong preference for linkage in whatever issue area. And if you look at all of the, there's a whole series of agreements that we have to return to with the EU across time, and making sure that we are better prepared in terms of not seeing linkage established early on, but also building partners within the EU that help us de-link, if I could put it in those terms. So I think that's a lesson learned exercise. I think the other thing, again, perhaps that we need to think a bit harder about is how we use our sector interest groups in the UK, which connect to continental Europeans, which lost a bit of their purpose because of Brexit. How far they act also as sort of bridgeheads for us in other countries, to sort of get the message out more effectively. And I would say one thing, to come back to sort of where we started, I think one of the things the UK government's been particularly poor on through recent years, and particularly where we are now in terms of the reset, which is our public diplomacy in third countries, I think is not good. And I don't think we're good enough at poking and prodding those groups that might have some influence, or at least get ideas under the nose of their government in third countries. We haven't worked those hard enough. And I'll give one concrete example. If you look across think tanks across Europe on the idea of closer foreign security and defence policy of Europe, you can count on the thumbs of one hand in member states where they brought out a paper which suggested this is what the relationship might look like. So to my mind, that's a sort of failing in terms of our ability perhaps to get in on the ground and encourage discussion, which obviously involves us, the UK government in third countries, perhaps sponsors in encouraging, facilitating that kind of a dialogue, because it can only work to the UK's advantage.
Yeah, that's a really interesting lesson learned. I mean, thinking about where we could maybe learn lessons from as well, is there anything from the recent EU-Switzerland agreements that we might want to learn lessons from?
Anyone from Switzerland?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can learn lessons from it, because the EU has shown that it can be flexible and it can swallow its own dogma. It's allowed Switzerland access to the single market for goods, without Switzerland being part of the single market for services, or in some other respects. Switzerland does accept free movement of people, more or less, of course. But I think the answer, the lesson to be learned is if a third country is a sufficiently important partner, you can think of a bespoke agreement that doesn't have precedent and is unique, and it's in the interest of both parties, and that's what this new Swiss deal, if it's agreed in a referendum in Switzerland, which is an open question, would be. So I think that's important. On the previous point, I mean, Richard's absolutely right. I think that the current British government has not been very good at engaging with it, not just with its public diplomacy broadly defined. I mean, British ministers, British officials have not been encouraged to go and take part in think tank debates, conferences, speaking tours, and so on. I mean, I think either in the UK or the EU itself. I regret that. I mean, I think previous Labour governments have been more open to debating and arguing with outsiders and experts, but I think the current government's political culture slightly militates against that, which I regret.
That's actually a bigger problem that affects a lot of, I mean, it's the same situation in Washington as well. They're constantly saying to me, you know, where are the other Brits? We're having big think tank events and all the other partners are there and the Brits are not. So we're not sending enough people. I think part of that comes...
So who should be there? Ministers? Or
I think there's
parliamentarians
ministers,
or academics?
I think parliamentarians, senior officials, but also, I mean, this understanding that the foreign policy security community outside government is a strategic instrument. It is part of the UK's
soft power
and influence operations, and we fund the entire sector way less than our peers. Most of our other peers, their governments directly fund a lot of this third sector, and support them to commission work and so on, and facilitate a lot of this function so that it's possible to do this. And that's understood as an extension of the national interest. So that's been, I think, very exposed by Brexit, because we sort of were just in Europe by virtue of being there. But it's a problem in all other markets as well. It's a bigger structural problem and probably worth an inquiry of its own.
The committee is going to Washington, so we're going to do our bit.
Oh, excellent.
Can I wrap up just by asking each of you to briefly just say, and the focus has been mainly on foreign policy and security, I mean, what should be the achievable objectives set by the government, particularly with the summit coming up, but as a part of the whole reset process? How should we judge whether or not this has been successful?
Well, I think it'll be successful if we help to restore trust, build a lot of goodwill. As I said before, it's a journalistic cliche, but it's really important because that goodwill has been missing in recent years. And I think we all agree, most of us agree, that we want the EU to be more flexible than it is inclined to be. And if you want it to be more flexible, you have to really generate that goodwill. So I think the government's made not a bad start. It's been fairly polite and house trained in the way it's dealt with the EU. But I think it could do a lot better, and a bit more vision would help. Continental politicians like a bit of vision, perhaps more than British politicians do. And a bit of vision, a bit about where we want to go in the long run would all help to enhance that goodwill and that good feeling about the UK, which is what we need if the EU is going to be more flexible and give us a better relationship. So I think more ambition, more on the UK side, and more flexibility on the EU side.
Thank you. Gaston.
I think in terms of the foreign defence and security cooperation, we want a lot more structured dialogue, formal consultation mechanisms, integration to be in the room, a lot more visibility of European planning, and the capacity to be a strategic partner in that. We want more access to EU defence and strategic instruments where it makes sense, and not just access to them, but the capacity to be involved in shaping the direction that they take, and I think we have legitimacy to do that. And then I think on the political piece, I think the government needs to be aware that these, red lines, they shouldn't be so constrained by the sort of straitjacket of them, understanding that public opinion actually, firstly, is extremely influenced by the media and its focus at a particular time on any given issue. But I've done public opinion polling about what people would be willing to accept in order to achieve greater cooperation with the EU, better trading relationship, better security and defence cooperation, all the things that the British people we know they care about. And, with ECJ paying money into EU funds, freedom of movement, there's actually quite a lot of movement between the three, and at various points, some are quite more acceptable than others. So I think not being, not seeing public opinion or political opinion in a sort of overbearing way that constrains the reality of the opportunities here. I think that has played too big a role in making government extremely cautious about these things. And I think for all that we want to see the EU being more ambitious on this, I think to some extent they will respond to perceptions of British ambition. I think there is a feeling that we need to move first. So hopefully they can move into a slightly more bold posture.
Thank you. Professor Whitman.
I think the first thing is I hope we get rid of the language of the reset once we've had the summit, that that we're onto a different plateau or whatever we might want to call it. We will get a summit statement that will read as all of these things do. I think the real test is, if you talk about the relationship with the US, for example, the EU constantly refers to something called the Transatlantic Declaration, which really set a sort of roadmap. If we get something like that, and we keep coming back to that summit declaration as a real sort of point of departure, really settles the question as to what the two sides want to do with one another, then I think it will be a great summit. I fear, unfortunately, that we'll get something, which is, it sort of looks as if it's put us in a slightly different place, but the level of ambition will be not all that it could be, particularly in the security and defence area. And there the UK has to continue to press for an exceptional relationship with the EU. Has to press through national capitals, through the other relationships that we have, for differentiation for the UK to recognise the role and the place that it plays in Europe's security. And it's going to need to play as we rebuild the sort of European security architecture.
Okay. Well, can I thank the three of you very much? We suspect that this subject will continue to feature on our agenda, so if you have further thoughts, please feel free to let us know. But thank you for coming this afternoon.